Where did you get the knife from?
From the kitchen.
And what type of knife was it?
The biggest one.
When you stabbed her in the back, what happened?
She screamed.
Did you see where you had stabbed him?
When I looked down, he was in his neck.
Holly Harvey, the girl who killed for love. Roots of rebellion. Holly Harvey was born in Georgia in the late 1980s into a family that appeared, from the outside, to reflect the typical Southern Christian lifestyles, strict, devout, and rooted in traditional values. She lived with her grandparents, Carl and Sarah Penny Franklin, in a modest house near the outskirts of Fayetteville. Two neighbors and churchgoers, the Franklins were pillars of the community. Carl was a retired military man, and Sarah volunteered frequently at their Baptist church. But beneath the surface of this stable exterior, Holly's life was a quiet storm brewing. Her mother, Carla, had a difficult past. She was a recovering drug addict who had spent time in and out of jail. Holly had been in her custody as a child, but when Carla's addiction worsened, the court gave custody to Holly's grandparents. Carl and Sarah stepped up, but their version of parenting was strict and yielding rules, rigid schedules, religious devotion, and very little emotional warmth. By her early teens, Holly began to rebel. She shaved her head. She pierced her lip. She scribbled lyrics from Marilyn Manson and Slipknot in her notebooks. She smoked marijuana and skipped school. Her grandparents responded by grounding her, removing privileges, and doubling down on church discipline. But none of it worked. Holly was angry, emotionally isolated, and desperate to be understood. At just 15, she felt suffocated in a household that equated strict control with love. She didn't feel seen. She felt imprisoned. And then, one day at Whitewater Middle School, she met Sandy Ketchum. Tangled up in love, Sandy Ketchum was everything Holly wasn't tanned, everything she wanted to be. Sandy was 16, 1 year older, and more experienced in the ways of rebellion. She had a troubled home life, too. Her father was absent, and her mother, like Carla, struggled with addiction and instability. Sandy had been in and out of foster homes and had a tough girl exterior forged by years of disappointment. But to Holly, she was a goddess, bold, independent, and best of all interested in her. What started as a friendship over cigarettes quickly turned into something deeper. The two girls began a secret romance, meeting in parks and abandoned sheds to talk, kiss, and dream about a life where they could be free. Sandy had a seductive influence on Holly. She promised they could run away, escape the rules, and start fresh somewhere far from Georgia. But Holly knew her grandparents would never allow it. They forbade her from seeing Sandy. They believed the relationship was sinful, a phase that could be prayed away. They took Holly's phone. They monitored her outings. But nothing could stop the gravitational pull the girls felt toward one another. The more the Franklins tried to control Holly, the more desperate she became to escape. And Sandy, always the bolder of the two, began to plant the seeds of a terrifying idea. What if they weren't around anymore? She whispered one night. Then no one could stop us. It wasn't an idle joke. It wasn't teenage angst. It was the beginning of a plan. Trouble at home. By the summer of 2004, the tension in the Franklin household had reached a breaking point. Holly was sneaking out nightly to meet Sandy. Her grandparents had caught her multiple times and had grown increasingly aggressive in their attempts to stop her. Carl, who had always enforced discipline with military precision, threatened to send Holly to a Christian reform school. Sarah began reading scriptures aloud at breakfast, begging God to save her granddaughter from unnatural urges. Holly felt demonized, unwanted, trapped, but more than anything, she felt terrified of losing Sandy, and Sandy knew it. Together, they began plotting their escape. First, it was simple. Steal money, take a car, and drive to Florida. But with no funds and no wheels, the plan always came back to one problem: Holly's grandparents. "They'll never let you go," Sandy repeated. "They'll drag you back from anywhere." They started stealing knives from Walmart and hardware stores. They talked late into the night about ways to leave undetected. But over time, their whispered dreams turned darker. "Maybe they deserve it," Sandy said one night, smoking a cigarette in the woods. "They're trying to kill." For more videos like this, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Killed who you really are, Holly nodded. They said, I'm going to hell. Well, Sandy replied, they can go first. The line chilled Holly, but she didn't say no. On August 2nd, 2004, the girls put the plan into motion. They would wait until the Franklins were asleep. They would sneak in, and then it would all be over. That night, the house on Willen Road sat still under a humid Georgia sky. Inside, Carl and Sarah Franklin had no idea that the granddaughter they raised with care and strict rules was about to change their lives and end them forever. A deadly pact. August 2nd, 2004. The night air in Fayette County, Georgia, was thick with humidity and silence. Holly Harvey paced in her bedroom, a serrated kitchen knife tucked into her hoodie. Sandy Ketchum sat on the edge of the bed, barefoot, holding a similar blade in her hand. They were both dressed in black, both terrified, and both ready to follow through with what they had rehearsed dozens of times in whispers and daydreams. We do this, we're free, Sandy whispered. Holly nodded. No turning back. They had smoked marijuana earlier that evening, hoping it would dull their nerves. But as midnight approached, adrenaline overtook the haze. Down the hall, Carl and Sarah Franklin were asleep in their bedroom. The house was quiet, motionless. Holly opened her bedroom door. The floor creaked beneath her socks. She took a step forward. Sandy followed, gripping the knife with the same false confidence of a soldier going into battle. She had always been the more dominant one, the planner, the motivator. But now that it was real, now that blood was the next step, Holly could sense the fear pulsing through both of them. They crept into the Franklins' room. Holly's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might wake them. Carl snored softly. Sarah lay with her back turned. The girls counted to 3. Holly plunged her knife into her grandfather's chest. Carl woke instantly, screaming in pain, confused and writhing. Sarah jolted upright, but Sandy was already on her, screaming, slashing. Blood sprayed across the walls, the bed, the ceiling fan. Carl tried to fight back, grabbing at Holly's arms, but she stabbed again and again. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her breath ragged with terror and rage. She could hear Sandy screaming as she wrestled with Sarah on the other side of the bed. Then, silence. The room smelled of copper and sweat. The floor was slick with blood. Carl Franklin lay dead, stabbed over a dozen times. Sarah gasped for breath on the floor, her throat slashed, her eyes wide open. Still alive, but fading. We have to go, Sandy shouted, covered in blood. Holly stared at her grandparents, her caretakers, the only stable people who had ever raised her, now dead. She turned away, and they ran. The escape. The girls grabbed $500 in cash, a credit card, and the keys to Carl's red Chevrolet truck. They stuffed clothes and a few belongings into backpacks and peeled out of the driveway before 3 a.m. They didn't have a real plan beyond run. They drove south on Highway 85 with the windows down, music blaring. Both were trembling with adrenaline and fear, but at moments they laughed, they kissed. They talked about where they'd go, maybe Daytona Beach, maybe Key West. Sandy wanted to get matching tattoos. Holly wanted to disappear. To them, this was freedom. It was finally real. By noon, they had made it to Tybee Island, a small beach town near Savannah, Georgia. They checked into a cheap motel using the stolen credit card and took showers, scrubbing the blood off their bodies. Holly cried in the bathroom. Sandy promised it would all be okay. That evening, they walked on the beach, barefoot, hand in hand, pretending to be just 2 runaways in love. 2 tourists, they looked like teen girls escaping a rough life, maybe running from bad parents. No one suspected what they had done less than 24 hours ago. But back in Fayetteville, reality was catching up. The bodies of Carl and Sarah Franklin had been discovered by concerned neighbors. Police arrived and found the scene drenched in blood. The attack was savage, overkill, personal. It didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. It looked like a rage killing. Within hours, Holly Harvey's name surfaced as a person of interest. Friends at school mentioned her problems with her grandparents, her relationship with Sandy, the threats she had made. A bolo, be on the lookout, alert was issued for the stolen Chevy truck. Police across the state were on high alert, and it wouldn't be long before someone spotted the girls. The arrest. August 4th, 2004. It took just 48 hours for authorities to catch up. The girls had been reckless. They used Carl Franklin's credit card to pay for gas and food. Surveillance footage showed them laughing at a fast food drive-thru, holding hands as they walked into a gas station. They weren't hardened criminals. They were children running from a crime that would define the rest of their lives. That morning, a Tybee Island motel manager called the police. The girls were acting strange, she said, nervous. She'd seen their pictures on the news that morning. Within minutes, police surrounded the motel. They knocked on the door. Holly opened it. Officers entered with guns drawn, shouting commands. The girls were ordered to the floor, handcuffed, arrested. "We didn't mean to," Holly screamed. "We didn't mean to." Sandy said nothing, just stared. They were taken into custody without resistance. The truck was impounded. Inside were bloody knives, a Bible, and a diary written by Holly, filled with dark entries. "I feel like I have no soul. I'd rather die than go back to them. Sandy is the only one who loves me." The news hit Fayette County like a bombshell. How could a 15-year-old girl and her 16-year-old girlfriend murder her own grandparents? Church members were stunned. Classmates at Whitewater Middle whispered in hallways. Teachers wept. The media latched on fast. 2 lesbian teen lovers, a religious Southern family, a brutal double homicide. The story had all the makings of a national headline. Overnight, Holly and Sandy became the new face of teenage rebellion gone deadly. But in their jail cells, separated and stripped of everything, reality began to set in. No more beaches, no more tattoos, no more dreams of freedom, just a cold, concrete future. Police interrogation, Detective Mike Pruitt, a veteran with the Fayette County Sheriff's Office, sat across from Holly in a small room, a voice recorder ticking quietly on the table. She was still wearing the same clothes she had on during the arrest, baggy jeans. Her wrists were raw from the cuffs. At first, she said nothing. Then, Detective Pruitt showed her photos of the crime scene. Holly broke down. She sobbed uncontrollably, covering her face, rocking back and forth in the chair. After their arrest in Tybee Island, Harvey and Sandy Ketchum were transported back to Fayette County and placed in separate holding facilities. The ride back was long, silent, and tense. Officers noted that Holly looked like a child who'd just seen hell. Sandy, on the other hand, sat stoically, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the road. The interrogations began immediately. "I didn't want to do it," she said. "I didn't want them to die." But when pressed, she didn't deny her involvement. She admitted to stabbing her grandfather. She admitted to watching Sandy attack her grandmother. But she insisted Sandy had pushed for it. "It was her idea," she said. She said we had to if we ever wanted to be free. In the next room, Sandy was giving a very different story. She claimed that Holly had always talked about killing her grandparents, that she had begged Sandy to help, that Sandy had been reluctant but went along with it because she didn't want to lose Holly. She said they were monsters. Sandy told detectives. She said she'd rather be dead than go back to them. The police quickly realized what was happening. The 2 girls were turning on each other. They were no longer co-conspirators. They were now desperate kids trying to survive the weight of what they had done. Both were charged with 2 counts of malice murder, felony murder, armed robbery, and aggravated assault. Prosecutors made it clear, though they were minors, they would be tried as adults, and the community still reeling from the savagery of the crime wanted justice. The media storm? By mid-August, the story of Holly, Harvey, and Sandy Ketchum had exploded into national headlines. Newspapers dubbed them the killer lesbians. Talk shows debated whether their relationship had been the cause or the symptom of the crime. Evangelical groups pointed to the girls as examples of moral decay. LGBTQ advocates pushed back, arguing the media was demonizing a queer relationship instead of focusing on the facts. CNN, Fox News, and the local Atlanta networks covered every court date, every hearing. The community of Fayetteville found itself divided. Some people saw Holly as a troubled teen manipulated by her older girlfriend, while others viewed her as a cold-blooded killer who turned on the people who loved her. At school, Classmates shared text messages and handwritten notes allegedly passed between Holly and Sandy. Some students defended Holly, recalling how miserable she'd been at home. Others claimed she had bragged about taking out the old man. The public fascination wasn't just about the murders. It was the love story turned horror tale. Two young girls, starved for affection, caught in a toxic relationship that led to bloodshed. People couldn't look away. In jail, Holly was placed on suicide watch. She was allowed no shoelaces, no belts, and no sharp objects. She cried daily, asking for Sandy, asking for her mother, asking for her grandmother, forgetting for moments at a time that Sarah Franklin was dead because of her own hands. Sandy, by contrast, seemed hardened. She gave interviews through her attorney, saying she had been manipulated, not the other way around. The prosecution began building its narrative. Motive, escape, and obsession. Method, cold-blooded premeditation. They emphasized that the girls had stolen money and a vehicle, had discussed the murders beforehand, and had carried them out while the victims were asleep and defenseless. The brutality of the attack, multiple stab wounds, throat slashing, was highlighted as proof that this wasn't a moment of passion, but a deliberate, vicious plan. But the defense saw it differently. They painted Holly as a deeply troubled child, suffering from emotional abuse, manipulated by an older, more dangerous partner. Her grandparents, they argued, had been controlling and mentally abusive. She had no escape, no options. The trial was set for early 2005, trial by jury. The trial of Holly Harvey and Sandy Ketchum began in February 2005, held at the Fayette County Superior Court under intense security and press coverage. The courthouse was packed. Everyday reporters, legal analysts, relatives of the Franklins, and curious citizens filled every seat. Both girls were charged with 2 counts of malice murder, felony murder, and multiple additional charges. Though initially set to be tried together, the court ultimately separated their cases due to their conflicting statements. Holly's trial came first. She arrived in court wearing a modest blouse and slacks. Her hair had grown out slightly since her arrest, and she looked younger than ever, almost like a middle school student, not a murderer. Her mother, Carla, sat behind her in tears, while family members of Carl and Sarah Franklin refused to even look at her. The prosecution opened with a bombshell. This was not an accident. This was not an act of fear. This was a carefully planned double homicide committed by a girl who wanted freedom, was willing to kill for it. They showed the bloody knives. They displayed Holly's diary. They read aloud texts and letters exchanged between the girls, including chilling lines like, "They can't control us. If they're dead and I want to wake up next to you, not them." Holly's defense attorney countered with a plea for compassion, emphasizing her age, her mental state, and the abuse she allegedly suffered under the Franklin's care. A psychologist testified that Holly had symptoms of depression, emotional trauma, and had been highly suggestible under Sandy's influence. She was a child, the attorney argued, a child who felt unloved, misunderstood, and trapped. Then came Holly's own testimony. Her voice cracked as she spoke. She admitted to stabbing her grandfather, but claimed it was out of fear and pressure. "Sandy told me we had to," she said. "I didn't want to lose her." She sobbed through descriptions of the night, the blood, the screams. The moment her grandmother gasped, "Why, Holly?" before falling silent. The courtroom went quiet. Even jurors looked shaken. But the prosecution pressed her on her escape, on using stolen money, on the gleeful behavior in Tybee Island. "If you felt so much remorse, why were you laughing on the beach the next day?" Holly broke down. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just didn't know what else to do." After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. On March 10, 2005, they returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. Holly Harvey was sentenced to 2 life sentences to be served consecutively, without the possibility of parole. Her face went blank. Her mother screamed. Members of the Franklin family wept. Holly was let out in shackles, just 16 years old. No longer a girl now, a convicted murderer. Sandy Ketchum's trial would come next. Sentencing in shock. Just weeks after Holly Harvey's trial ended in a double life sentence, the state of Georgia moved forward with the prosecution of her co-defendant and former lover Sandy Ketchum. The courtroom energy was different this time. Sandy didn't cry, She didn't shake. She didn't speak much at all. When her name was called, she stood with her chin raised slightly, her hair pulled back tight, and her hands in chains. Prosecutors described her as calculating, dangerous, and the true mastermind of the crime. The narrative had shifted. In this trial, Sandy was portrayed as the predator. Her defense attorneys tried to humanize her. They brought up her unstable home life, her mother's addiction, and her repeated placements in foster care. She had dropped out of school in the 9th grade. She had started running away at age 13, and by the time she met Holly, she was already a traumatized and directionless teenager. She was searching for love, her attorney said. She found it in the wrong place, and it led her down a horrific path. Still, the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented notes written by Sandy that discussed killing the Franklins as early as a month before the murders. Witnesses testified that Sandy bragged about cutting throats and getting rid of the old people. Even more damning, a recording of Sandy after her arrest, telling an officer they had it coming. Unlike Holly, Sandy didn't testify. She sat silent through most of the trial, occasionally glancing at her mother, who showed up for only 2 days. On April 3, 2005, Sandy was also found guilty of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. There was no outburst, no tears, just silence. The 2 girls, once passionately bonded by love and desperation, were now separated forever. Condemned to spend their lives behind prison walls, their stories sealed in blood. Life behind bars. The Georgia Department of Corrections processed Holly and Sandy within days of their sentencing. Both were classified as level 5 inmates, maximum security, to the nature of their crimes and their sentences. Holly was sent to Pulaski State Prison, a sprawling high-security women's facility. Sandy was assigned to Lee Arrendale State Prison, the largest female prison in Georgia, nearly 2 hours north. They were never allowed to communicate again. The prison system did not treat them as minors, though they were technically 16 and 17 at the time of their convictions. They were sentenced as adults and placed in the general population, with women serving decades or life for robbery, assault, and murder. Life inside wasn't easy. Holly quickly became known as the quiet one. She kept to herself, wrote in journals, and attended therapy sessions when allowed. Correctional officers said she appeared broken still, emotionally immature, clinging to the belief that she might someday be forgiven. She started attending religious services and eventually began working in the prison's kitchen. Her letters to her mother, Carla, were filled with apologies. "I still see her face, Grandma, and I sleep," she wrote. "She looked at me like I was still her little girl. Even after everything." Carla visited once a month. She had relapsed briefly after the trial, but was now back in recovery and working a custodial job in Atlanta. "It's the only thing I got left," she told a local reporter. Holly's all I got. Sandy, by contrast, adapted quickly to prison life. She had fewer visits, no support system, and a tougher exterior. She joined a prison gang for protection and was involved in at least one altercation in her first year. Her record inside was marred by disciplinary write-ups for possession of contraband, insubordination, and refusing orders. Still, she earned a GED in 2007 and began training in vocational programs. Correctional staff described her as intelligent, capable, but cold. She rarely spoke about the murders, never cried, and never reached out to Holly. The bond that had once consumed them, passionate, obsessive, and fatal, was gone. All that remained was the echo of what they had done. Family fallout. The emotional wreckage left behind by the murders of Carl and Sarah Franklin extended far beyond the courtroom. Carl and Sarah had been active in their church, well known in their community, and deeply loved by their surviving children and grandchildren. Their murders left a vacuum in their family, one filled with unanswered questions, rage, and unbearable sorrow. Sharon Franklin, Carl's oldest daughter and Holly's aunt, was one of the first on the scene after the police called. She had to identify the bodies. They were butchered, she later said in a victim impact statement. They raised Holly. They gave her a roof, food, love, structure, and she paid them with knives. Sarah's sister, Margaret, stopped speaking to the media entirely after the trial. "There's no fixing this," she told a friend. "We buried 2 saints and lost a child all at once." Even Holly's mother, Carla, faced a vicious backlash. Members of the Franklin family blamed her for losing custody, for passing on trauma, for not raising Holly herself. If you hadn't been strung out, one relative allegedly said at the courthouse, they'd still be alive. She began writing letters to the Franklin surviving relatives, pleading for understanding. Some were returned unopened. Others were never answered. At Sarah and Carl's church, 2 new stained glass windows were installed in their memory. One bore a small dedication that read, "For those who served God with love, even unto death." But the pastor never mentioned Holly's name from the pulpit again. In the years that followed, the story of Holly and Sandy faded from national headlines. New scandals took their place. New crimes grabbed attention. But in Fayette County, the memory never dimmed. Every August, local papers quietly noted the anniversary of the murders. Every holiday, the empty chairs at the Franklin family table served as grim reminders. And somewhere inside 2 different prisons, 2 women once in love, now separated by concrete and fate-served life sentences for a love that turned to murder. The role of influence, nature versus nurture. Long after the courtroom lights faded, the debate surrounding the case of Holly Harvey and Sandy Ketchum continued in academic and legal circles. It became a tragic case study of youth violence, toxic relationships, and the enduring nature versus nurture debate. Was Holly Harvey born with the capacity for violence? Or did years of emotional isolation, family trauma, and the influence of Sandy create the perfect storm? Psychologists who examined her prior to trial described Holly as emotionally stunted, codependent, and profoundly insecure. She had been separated from her biological mother, raised in a strict religious environment, and then drawn into a relationship with an older, more dominant partner who validated her in a way no adult ever had. Her attachment to Sandy wasn't just romantic, it was obsessive. When we looked at Holly's emotional profile, said one forensic psychologist, what we saw was a young person desperate to feel loved, even if it meant going against her entire moral compass. Sandy, on the other hand, exhibited signs of antisocial behavior, low empathy, and impulse control issues. Multiple foster placements, unstable housing, history of violence toward other students. She had run away from 3 group homes by age 15. Together, the girls formed a dangerous dyad. The clinical term is folie à deux, a shared psychosis or mutual delusion. In such relationships, one partner, usually the dominant, imposes a distorted worldview on the other, leading both into dangerous behavior. Experts debated whether Sandy manipulated Holly into believing murder was the only way to escape, but others pointed to Holly's own journal entries filled with dark imagery, references to demons, and rage toward her grandparents. "I wish they would die in their sleep," one entry read. "I wish they'd stop making me feel like I'm a disease." That wasn't Sandy's handwriting, it was Holly's. The conclusion? There was no simple answer. What happened on that August night in 2004 was the result of years of pain, fear, and emotional neglect, combined with a toxic, all-consuming love between 2 broken kids. Letters from prison. Years after her sentencing, Holly Harvey began writing. Not poetry, not diaries, but letters to her mother, to herself, and eventually to people who wrote to her from outside. Incarcerated youth often attract attention from strangers, true crime enthusiasts, religious groups, and journalists seeking insight into the mind of a young killer. Holly was no different. She received dozens of letters over the years, many of them asking the same question, "Do you regret it?" Her responses were often long, handwritten, and carefully worded. In one letter to a psychology student from Emory University, Holly wrote, "I think about them every night, not just their faces. The sounds, the way Grandma looked at me. I wanted to stop. I really did. But I was already drowning. And when you're that far gone, you don't care who you drag under with you." She never denied her role in the murders. In fact, her letters consistently took responsibility. But she struggled to articulate exactly when she lost control, when fantasy became reality. "It felt like a dream," she wrote in another letter. "A terrible, endless nightmare that only ended when the cold floor of the jail cell reminded me it was real." To her mother Carla, the letters were more emotional. They were filled with longing, apologies, childhood memories, and sometimes anger. "You were supposed to be there," she wrote once. "Maybe if you had stayed clean, I wouldn't have ended up with Grandma and Grandpa. Maybe I wouldn't have snapped." Carla, to her credit, never stopped writing back. Their relationship fractured, rebuilt. Tested remained one of the only things Holly had left. In 2010, a documentary filmmaker from Atlanta wrote to Holly requesting an interview for a prison-based true crime series. Holly declined. "I don't want to be a horror story," she wrote back. "I already lived it once. I don't want to act it out again for TV." Some letters were filled with scripture. Holly had begun attending religious services again and read the Bible regularly. She told one pen pal she had memorized Psalm 51, "Create in me a clean heart, O God," and said it each night before bed. But redemption, for her, was complicated. "Even if God forgives me," she wrote, "they won't. And I get that." She never reached out to the Franklin family. She never mentioned Sandy, redemption, or remorse. By 2020, Holly Harvey had spent more years in prison than she had in freedom. She was now in her early 30s. Her face had matured. Her voice had deepened. She had become a fixture inside Pulaski State Prison, known among some inmates as Preacher Girl, for her quiet devotion to scripture and her role in leading small prayer circles. Yet the question lingered. Was she truly remorseful or just institutionalized? Some corrections officers believed she had changed. They said she helped mediate fights between inmates, volunteered for extra cleaning shifts, and avoided drama. Others remained skeptical. "She knows the system now," one guard said. "She knows how to survive." That's different than being sorry. Her mother, Carla, remained her fiercest advocate. In interviews with local media, she insisted Holly had found God and was working toward healing. "She never walked out of that place," Carla said. "But she's not the same girl who walked in." Some members of the Franklin family weren't convinced. They had never received an apology, never received a letter, and never wanted one. "Holly killed my parents," said Sharon Franklin. "I don't care how many Bible verses she learns. That doesn't bring them back." The Georgia Parole Board issued a public statement in 2018 reaffirming that Holly Harvey would never be eligible for release. Her sentence is permanent. She will remain incarcerated for the duration of her natural life. That didn't stop others from debating her legacy. A 2021 criminology podcast revisited the case, asking listeners if society should offer rehabilitation to teen offenders, those who commit the worst crimes. The case sparked renewed arguments about adolescent brain development, the age of legal accountability, and whether any child should be thrown away forever. In one episode, a host read aloud a passage from one of Holly's recent letters. "Some nights, I still wake up with blood on my hands. I know it's not real, but I see it, I smell it, I live it again. That's my prison, not these walls. I'll never be free." It was raw, haunting, and ambiguous. Was that remorse, regret, or just guilt? To this day, no one really knows what lies in the deepest parts of Holly Harvey's heart. But what's certain is that she never stopped trying to answer that question herself. Sandy Ketchum's path. While Holly Harvey slowly transformed into a soft-spoken, scripture-quoting inmate, Sandy Ketchum took a different path inside the walls of Lee Arrendale State Prison. Arrendale, Georgia's largest women's correctional facility, was a rougher environment than Pulaski. Located in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, it housed some of the state's most violent female offenders. Inmates called it the jungle. Sandy arrived at 17 with a reputation already burned into the system: manipulator, instigator, killer. She didn't cry at sentencing. She didn't flinch at photographs of the crime. And she never showed remorse. That carried over inside. During her first few years, Sandy was cited for fighting contraband possession and disobeying orders. One corrections officer said she walked around like she owned the place, like she wanted people to know she wasn't afraid of anything. She became affiliated with a prison clique known as the Originals, a small group of women serving life sentences who had nothing left to lose. Together, they ran contraband rings, intimidated other inmates, and openly challenged prison authority. Sandy reportedly held a leadership role within the group for several years, but in 2014, something changed. Sandy was involved in a fight that landed her in solitary confinement for 45 days. During that time, she lost visitation privileges, yard time, and all contact with the outside world. It was, according to reports, her lowest point. After that, her behavior improved. She enrolled in a GED program and passed with high scores. She took up painting. She began working in the prison's animal therapy unit, caring for abused and abandoned dogs that were brought in for rehabilitation. When asked by a prison counselor what triggered the change, Sandy reportedly said, "I got tired of being angry. It wasn't helping. It didn't bring them back." She never attempted to contact Holly. To this day, she has never given a formal interview, never apologized publicly, and never challenged her conviction. Some believe her silence is proof of guilt and cold-heartedness. Others see it as a sign that she simply cut herself off emotionally to survive. But whatever the truth may be, Sandy Ketchum remains one of Georgia's youngest double murderers ever sentenced to die in prison. Her life frozen at 16, her legacy shaped by one violent night and the fallout that followed. The victims remembered. The murder of Carl and Sarah Franklin did more than take two lives, it shattered a legacy. The Franklins had been the backbone of their church community. Raising Holly after her mother's addiction sent her spiraling into instability. They were described as strict but deeply loving, people who believed in discipline, order, and above all, faith. In the years after their deaths, those who loved them tried desperately to preserve their memory as more than just the grandparents who got murdered. At First Baptist Church of Fayetteville, a special bench was dedicated in their honor. It was placed in the church's memorial garden and bore a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Carl and Sarah Franklin, servants of Christ, givers of second chances." Every August, the church holds a day of peace service, where members light candles for victims of violence. The Franklins are always the first names read aloud. Carl's brother, James Franklin, took up advocacy work after the trial. He joined a victims' rights group and began speaking at local high schools about teen violence and family conflict. His message was direct. If something's wrong at home, speak up. Violence is never the answer. Not ever. Sarah's niece, Julie Mathis, created a scholarship fund in their name. The Franklin Family Resilience Scholarship is awarded annually to a student who has overcome adversity and plans to study social work, counseling, or criminal justice. They were trying to save a child, Julie said during one award ceremony, and they paid for it with their lives. The surviving members of the Franklin family remain divided on how to remember Holly. Some still refer to her as that murderer, refusing to speak her name. Others, mostly younger relatives, acknowledge the tragedy in fuller context. "She was a child too," one cousin said. "A child who made a terrible choice, but she didn't just come out of nowhere." Yet for all the efforts to honor Carl and Sarah, the tragedy still casts a long shadow. Every Christmas, their chairs at the family table remain empty. Every Easter, their photos are placed at the front pews of the church. And every August, someone in the family has to explain to a new generation why Grandpa and Grandma never came home. Georgia's legal response: the brutal double homicide committed by Holly, Harvey, and Sandy Ketchum didn't just shake a community, it spurred conversation across Georgia about juvenile justice and the treatment of minors in violent crimes. In 2004, Georgia law allowed for teenagers as young as 13 to be tried as adults for certain crimes, including murder, but the Harvey Ketchum case sparked new debate about the permanency of life sentences for juveniles. Critics argued that while the crimes were horrific, the state should have mechanisms for review or possible parole decades later. Teen brains, they argued, are still developing. The U.S. Supreme Court echoed this in later rulings, Graham v. Florida 2010 and Miller v. Alabama 2012, which restricted mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles. Georgia, however, remained relatively strict. State lawmakers briefly considered a juvenile sentencing reform bill in 2006 that would have required parole eligibility for juvenile offenders after 30 years, but it never passed. Opponents of the bill often referenced the Harvey case directly. "I dare you to sit in that courtroom," one representative said on the House floor, "and tell Carl and Sarah Franklin's family that their killers deserve a second chance." Still, the national tide shifted. By 2015, several states, including California and Illinois, had adopted second-look laws for juveniles. Sentenced to life, Georgia resisted, though advocacy groups like the Southern Center for Human Rights continued to lobby for change. In response, local prosecutors doubled down on their authority. They used the Harvey case as a benchmark proof that some teens, despite their age, can commit irredeemable acts. District Attorney Scott Ballard, who prosecuted Holly and Sandy, later said, "We didn't put kids on trial, we put murderers on trial." Their ages didn't change the horror of what they did. In 2018, a motion was filed by a juvenile justice organization requesting sentence reconsideration for Holly Harvey. It was denied. Georgia's Attorney General issued a statement reaffirming the stance. The state of Georgia recognizes the gravity of this crime. No evidence suggests rehabilitation is appropriate. No sentence modification will be considered. The message was clear. In Georgia, some crimes leave no room for mercy. Inside the mind of a teenage killer, forensic psychologists, criminal behaviorists, and trauma counselors have spent years dissecting the case of Holly Harvey and Sandy Ketchum, using it as a chilling study in adolescent criminal psychology. From the outside, the case looked like a teenage rebellion turned fatal. But inside the minds of these girls was something far more complex and deeply tragic. Holly Harvey was diagnosed post-arrest with symptoms consistent with depressive disorder, dependent personality traits, and emotional dysregulation. According to one psychological evaluation submitted during pretrial hearings, Holly displayed an extreme sensitivity to perceived rejection, especially from female authority figures. Her emotional development, they noted, was severely delayed, likely the result of prolonged instability during her formative years. Raised by grandparents who enforced strict religious rules, no secular music, no dating, no open conversations about sexuality, had no emotional outlet for her identity. When she met Sandy, someone older and affirming, it felt like an escape hatch from her tightly controlled world. One psychologist described their relationship as trauma bonded. This wasn't a healthy love. It was survival, wrapped in codependency. Sandy became Holly's entire world, her protector, her partner, her mirror. And that's the most dangerous kind of love for someone who already feels invisible. Sandy, by contrast, showed traits aligned with conduct disorder, impulse control, dysfunction, and manipulative behavior. Records from her early adolescence revealed violent incidents, school suspensions, and repeated acts of self-harm. She had no stable caregiver by age 12. Psychiatrists concluded she was emotionally hardened before age 14 and had developed deep mistrust of adults. When she found Holly, a younger, more vulnerable girl, she asserted control in the only way she knew, dominance disguised as affection. Together, they created an alternate reality, one in which murder seemed like the only logical exit from a life of pain. And once that reality was set in motion, there was no turning back. Voices from the inside. Years passed, the world moved on. But inside Georgia's prison system, both Holly and Sandy remained notorious, not just because of their crime, but because they were the youngest. Female inmates ever to receive double life sentences without parole in the state. Inmates who served time alongside them recalled the strange energy each girl carried. She never acted out. She kept a journal. She cried sometimes at night, especially on the anniversary of the murders. You could tell she carried that guilt around like it weighed 100 pounds. According to Tonya, Holly avoided fights, helped tutor other inmates in basic math, and spent most of her free time reading. She was smart, Tonya said, but you could also tell she'd been broken long before she ever got to prison. Martha L., another inmate at Pulaski, shared a more critical view. Don't let the church stuff fool you. Holly knows exactly what she did. She just wants people to forget how brutal it was. Sandy's reputation at Arendelle, on the other hand, was far more intimidating. Dawn C., a former inmate and now reentry specialist, said Sandy had a command presence from day one. You didn't mess with her. She was sharp, always watching. You could feel it when she walked into a room. While Holly retreated inward, Sandy built alliances. She was respected, said Dawn, and feared. But she wasn't evil, just numb, like her soul had turned off. Over time, though, even Sandy changed. According to a 2022 corrections report, she had been incident-free for 5 consecutive years. She earned vocational certificates in welding and small engine repair. She requested to transfer into the faith-based dorm but was denied. She never asked for parole, never appealed, never said a word to the press. She lives in silence, one prison chaplain noted. And I think that's where her guilt lives too. The anatomy of obsession. At the heart of the Holly Harvey case lies one undeniable truth. This was never just about murder. It was about obsession, isolation, and the catastrophic consequences of emotional starvation. Sociologists and psychologists alike have drawn comparisons between Holly and Sandy's relationship and classic Bonnie and Clyde dynamics where true troubled individuals form a romantic and psychological bond that spirals into violence. But in this case, the dynamic was even more dangerous. They weren't running toward freedom, said one behavioral analyst. They were running away from abandonment. Both girls were, in their own ways, deeply unloved, or at least they felt they were. That perception that the world had no place for them was the oxygen their obsession fed on. Holly's grandmother, Sarah, had tried to instill values she believed were righteous, but her methods strict religious control, moral rigidity, and condemnation of Holly's sexuality may have created the very emotional void Holly fell into. Sandy, left to bounce between homes, abused by family and ignored by the system, craved control. Her affection for Holly wasn't just romantic, it was protective, possessive. She saw Holly as someone she could mold, someone who would never leave her. It's the same psychological force behind many intimate partner homicides. Only in this case, it was two young girls, both victims in their own way, who turned their trauma outward. Obsession, said one clinical expert, is when love becomes a weapon. And that's exactly what happened here. The two knives they used were pulled from the Franklin family kitchen. Everyday tools turned deadly instruments. But the real weapons, some argue, were desperation and blind love. This wasn't a crime of greed. It wasn't even a crime of hatred. It was a crime of illusion to teenagers, so convinced that their pain could be erased by blood that they murdered the only people trying to raise them. In the years since, both have lived in the wreckage of that lie, and so have the families they left behind. Public memory fades. 2 decades after the brutal double homicide in Fayetteville, Georgia, the case of Holly Harvey and Sandy Ketchum no longer made national headlines. It no longer spurred protests or fueled television debates. Time had moved forward, even if the people at the heart of the story had not. But in Fayette County, the memory remained. Every few years, the local newspaper, The Citizen, ran a small piece in the On This Day section, briefly recalling the night Carl and Sarah Franklin were murdered by their granddaughter and her teenage lover. There were no graphic details, no new interviews, just a grim reminder of what had been lost. Younger generations, those born after 2004, often heard the story secondhand. They'd learn about it in criminal justice classes, true crime podcasts, or from older relatives who'd lived through the media frenzy. The name Holly Harvey still carried a shadow in some corners of Fayetteville, spoken and hushed. Tones in church pews or family kitchens. For many, though, the case had blurred into myth, a local horror story, something unreal. But for the Franklin family, it was never distant. Each August 2nd, they still gathered those who remained too light to candles in silence. One for Carl, one for Sarah. No speeches, no sermons, just silence. Every Christmas, a red ribbon was tied to the mailbox at the old Franklin home. It was symbolic and unspoken message that love lived there once, even if violence had stolen it. For Carla, Holly's mother, public memory was both a curse and a comfort. Sometimes I want people to forget. Sometimes I want to scream at them to remember everything. Because Holly's not just that thing they read about. She's still here, still breathing, still trying. But most of the world had moved on. And maybe that, in its own way, was the most merciful thing that could have happened. Where are they now? As of 2025, both Holly Harvey and Sandy Ketchum remain incarcerated in Georgia, each serving 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Holly, now in her mid-30s, is housed at Pulaski State Prison, where she works in the prison library. She remains active in religious programming and serves as a peer mentor to younger inmates entering the system. Staff describe her as quiet, compliant, and deeply introverted. She rarely engages with media inquiries, but continues to respond to letters mostly from students, researchers, and religious groups. In 2023, She completed a correspondence course in biblical studies through an accredited ministry program. In a private note to one of her pen pals, she wrote, "I'll never undo what I did. I stopped being 15 the second I held that knife. But I believe God still hears me when I speak." She remains close to her mother, Carla, who visits once every few months and speaks regularly with chaplains on her daughter's behalf. Sandy Ketchum, by contrast, is serving her sentence at Lee Arrendale State Prison, though less is known publicly about her current life. Doc records show she remains active in educational programming and has had no disciplinary infractions in the last 6 years. According to a former staff member, Sandy now works in the automotive repair unit at the prison and spends most of her time in a small reading circle. She keeps to herself, they said. You'd never guess who she was if you didn't already know. She has never given an interview. She has never filed an appeal. Both women are ineligible for parole. Both live in concrete spaces where the past is never more than a memory away, and neither has seen or spoken to the other since their arrest in August 2004. Lessons from a tragedy. The Holly Harvey case remains, to this day, one of the most emotionally complex crimes in Georgia's modern history, not just because of the brutality of the murders, but because of the youth of the perpetrators and the love story turned violent. Experts, educators, and victim advocates continue to use the case as a teaching tool. It's taught in psychology seminars, criminal justice classes, and seminars on domestic violence. From these lessons, a few themes have emerged. 1. Emotional abuse leaves invisible scars. Holly wasn't physically beaten. She wasn't starved or tortured. But the emotional restrictions, the moral condemnation, and the rigid home structure she lived under created a deep psychological wound. She felt trapped, unheard, and alienated emotions that festered in silence until they exploded. 2. Vulnerable teens can bond in dangerous ways. The love between Holly and Sandy wasn't criminal on its own, but it became a catalyst for murder when combined with trauma, desperation, and poor judgment. Their relationship was unhealthy, possessive, and destructive, showcasing how isolation can distort even the deepest feelings. 3. The system often fails before it punishes. Sandy's childhood was marked by instability, group homes, and parental neglect. Holly's mother struggled with addiction. Neither girl had a proper support system before tragedy struck. In many ways, the system punished them long before it sentenced them. 4. Victims deserve to be more than footnotes. Carl and Sarah Franklin were not just the grandparents who got murdered. They were churchgoers, caregivers, human beings. The case reminds the world that victims can be overshadowed by the notoriety of their killers, and that we must continue to tell their stories, too. Ultimately, the case became less about what happened on that single night and more about the emotional decay that led up to it. It became a warning, a plea, and a tragedy that keeps teaching. Final reflections. In the end, the story of Holly Harvey and Sandy Ketchum is not one of monsters, it is one of humans. Flawed, broken, capable of love, and equally capable of destruction. Holly was 15 years old when she held a knife to her grandfather's throat. 15 when she watched her grandmother plead for her life. 15 when she kissed Sandy and ran away to the beach, hoping the world would never catch them. But the world did, and what followed was a reckoning that continues to ripple outward. 2 people died. 2 more were condemned to die in prison. A family was torn apart. A church grieved. A small town in Georgia became a national headline. But maybe the most haunting part of this story isn't the violence. It's the wasted youth, the what-ifs. What if Holly had found a better home? What if Sandy had received trauma counseling? What if someone had intervened? What if love hadn't become a weapon? There are no happy endings in this story. No real sense of closure. No miracle twist. Just a girl who wakes up each morning behind bars, writes scriptures in her journal, and dreams of forgiveness she may never receive. Just another girl who turns wrenches in a prison garage, remembering a face she hasn't seen in over 20 years. And just a quiet town that learned the hard way what happens when broken people break each other. This was the story of Holly Harvey and Sandy Ketchum. Not a horror story, a human one.